Now then, I need you to be a very good bear while I listen to your chest. Right. I think I better take your temperature as well. Oh, right. Well, I think that you need a little cup of juice and a nice hot water bottle to make you feel better, okay? Oh, hello. I'm Rob. Teddy's not feeling very well today, so I thought I could be his doctor and try to fix him. What do you think would make him feel better? Oh, I think he needs some pink milk and a biscuit, or maybe some cake. Now then, in tonight's bedtime story, Ted can't find the doctor, so he decides it's time for him to take over. The story's by Andrea, Beaty and Pascal Lemaitre, and it's called Dr. Ted. One morning, Ted woke up, got out of bed, and bumped his knee. That's not good, thought Ted. I need a doctor. He looked everywhere, but he couldn't find one. And since Ted couldn't find a doctor, he became a doctor. Now, Dr. Ted didn't have an office, so he made one. Dr. Ted didn't have a big bandage, so he made one of those too. Now all I need is a patient, he thought. So he waited for one to arrive. He waited, and he waited, and he waited. Nice waiting room, thought Dr. Ted. And then he waited some more. I think it's time for a house call, he thought. Hello, he called. Dr. Ted's mother was in the kitchen. You have measles, said Dr. Ted. We should operate. Those are my freckles, said his mother. Come on, it's time for breakfast. At school, Dr. Ted sat in the third row of Mrs. Johnson's class. All around him, children coughed, sniffled, and sneezed. Dr. Ted smiled. Patients, he thought. The patients were very germy. At lunchtime, Dr. Ted took their temperatures and their blood pressure. He gave them good medical advice, and they were very grateful. Dr. Ted was such a good doctor that even Mrs. Johnson came to see him. You can't be a doctor in the canteen, she said. You have mumps, said Dr. Ted. Crutches could help. Those are my cheeks, said Mrs. Johnson. Come on, it's time for lunch. Head teacher Bigham walked in. Dr. Ted could tell he was very sick. He needed a doctor. We already have a school doctor who visits on Fridays, said head teacher Bigham with a smile. You have gingivitis, said Dr. Ted. You need a full body cast. Head teacher Bigham frowned. You also have bad breath, said Dr. Ted. You need an injection. The head teacher's face turned bright red. And a fever, said Dr. Ted. You need a transplant. We already have a school doctor. Head teacher Bigham pointed towards the door. We could do something about these smelly feet, said Dr. Ted. Go home, said head teacher Bigham. Dr. Ted was very sad. He packed up his big bandage and went home. That night, he took 2 biscuits and went straight to bed. The next day, at break time, Ted sat on a bench and sighed. He watched Frances Sylvester do gymnastics on the monkey bars. She was very talented. Everyone thought so, especially Mrs. Johnson and head teacher Bigham. Frances finished her routine with a triple twisting somersault. She landed on Mrs. Johnson. Ouch! cried Mrs. Johnson. My ankle! Head teacher Bigham ran this way and that. Help! He called. Call an ambulance. Call the fire brigade. Call the library. Just call somebody. But Dr. Ted was already there. He wrapped Mrs. Johnson's ankle with his big bandage. He checked her vision and her tonsils. Take 2 biscuits, he said. You'll feel better in the morning. Just then, the ambulance arrived, and the fire brigade, and the librarians. "It's a good thing you had Dr. Ted," they all said. "There's always room for another school doctor," said Mrs. Johnson. "My work here is done," said Dr. Ted. "Keep the bandage." Head teacher Bigham's face turned bright red. "You really should do something about that fever," said Dr. Ted. That night, Dr. Ted closed his office, packed away his stethoscope, and went to sleep, knowing he'd done a good job. The next morning, Ted woke up, got out of bed, and sniffed the air. It smelt like burnt toast. "That's not good," thought Ted. "I need a fire engine." And that story was called Dr. Ted. So that's what you need, Teddy. 2 biscuits and a good night's sleep, just like Dr. Ted ordered. Which reminds me, it's time for you to go to bed now, and I'll see you soon for another story. Night-night.